Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing on inventories and inventory systems design for video games, which is part of a larger suite of videos that I'm doing on video game design topics. And as is fairly traditional for my short runs of videos on a particular topic, I present one that I've got particular design thoughts. This is usually around player-centered design, so thinking about how your design choices affect the playing experience and what players might or might not do as a result. So I have a few thoughts that I want to present that cover inventories and inventory systems and the design of items and what kind of sets of items you might have in your game as well. So it's a kind of dual purpose topic in that sense. So the first one I'll say is to embrace the fantasy, which doesn't mean that your game is going to be a fantasy game. What it's referring to is the fact that games are, by their very nature, a fantasy. And one of the brilliant things about games is the ability to get to do things that you wouldn't get to do in real life. And when you're thinking about the items that might be available to a player, it's worth bearing this in mind. Not every item in the game, and by no means, is going to be an item that the player is going to be excited about possessing. But there is an opportunity here to include items that give that sort of joy of possession to players. So if you're doing something that's got real-world simulation aspects, for example, a car driving game, you might want to give them iconic cars that they're able to have in their garage and drive around and have the joy of getting those things that they wouldn't be able to afford in real life. Things like fantasy games, having a sword is fun. Having a great big battle axe is possibly even more fun, to my mind. Maybe that says something about me, I don't know. Having a cartoony fantasy type game, it might be great to have those shoes with the springs on the bottom that let you bounce up and down, or whatever it is that you're gonna delight the player with. Use the design of objects as an arena in which some of this can be done, I think. The second thing I want to talk about is internal consistency. So this means loads of things. And want to pull out a couple of examples. Some of this is about player expectations. So it may be that if you've got 3 different tiers of cloth armor, then that means you should similarly have 3 different tiers of mail armor and 3 different tiers of plate armor. And using a consistent approach to anything where that can be helpful is good. It also very strongly applies in terms of interface and the way things are presented to players. So if you have an ability to show the information about a particular item, and if when you show the information about a sword, the weight is on the bottom left, and if you're showing information about a piece of armor, the weight is on the top right, that's inconsistent, and that's just not great for players. It seems like a fairly obvious thing to say, but it's amazing how often I come across inconsistency in game design. Similarly, if you've got chests and inventory and equip slots and maybe even bank systems, then using visually similar and conceptually similar ways of dealing with them is very helpful. And I can kind of see how you could probably see how it could cause a big mess if you have different stack limits in different ways that you store things. That's just a nightmare. But just the consistency of the presentation and the way that it's laid out can be really helpful to players. I want to talk about something that is really to me, really, really obvious. And I think for most people dipping into game design, this is also obvious, which is that whatever you do should be consistent with the game setting and with the style of the game and the nature of the game. So if you're creating a uh, historically accurate, fairly serious simulation game on, oh, let's say on World War I combat, then the stylings that you use around your inventory will be appropriate to that. And I'm not quite sure what you'd use, but what would you keep things in a backpack maybe, or in some kind of tin metal container? And so styling the edges so that it is like that seems reasonable. Also, um, keeping your items in keeping with your game. So again, World War One combat game, you're not going to give players a digital watch unless there's some very odd things going on in your game. If the point of your game is to have anachronistic things that are a source of humour, then by all means go for that sort of thing because that is entirely appropriate. So I'm going to move on because I could go on for ages and with lots of examples of this, but I do think most people really do understand what I'm talking about here. Collecting is fun. So um, I was going to say, especially for kids, I don't think that's true, actually. The number of hobbies that are based around the concept of collecting something is phenomenal. It's obvious that people enjoy collecting things in real life and in games, and this transfers very well into games. The still image that we had at the very start of this video was from Forza Horizon 5. Let's say that with my teeth in. And one of the major aspects of the Forza Horizon games is collection of cars. And this is a thing that can be of great joy to the players, being able to collect sets of cars from different manufacturers, being able to collect the cars that they've always wanted to actually have in real life. Um, this is uh, a beautiful part of many games. Sometimes you have collection stuff in games where you've, like in a 3D platform game, you might be asked to collect all 100 red stars in a level. And that's okay as collection. That's really more about exploration than actually about collection. Collection is usually things that are somehow categorized similarly but are different and have different details. So, for example, collectible card games like Magic the Gathering, the layout of the card is pretty much the same. You've got lots of cards and they're all cards, but there's a huge variety of different cards. And actually, it's a game, so there's the gameplay aspects to them as well. But just collecting the cards in itself can be fun. And so you can facilitate this in games. And this is obviously, it's around that, or at least some of this can be around the area of items and stuff. There is a little bit of conflict here potentially if you want to have collections of stuff in games. Is that then potentially competes against the idea of inventory limits, and you might need a different way of managing collected items that doesn't impinge on your inventories. Otherwise, people will stop collecting because it bungs up their inventory. So I want to move on to talking about inventory limits. Um, Many games have limits to inventories. I had an earlier video in this series where I talked about different strategies for doing this. I firmly believe that uh, most modern RPGs have inventory limits for a good reason, and the gameplay result of not having an inventory limits is that you will have some players who will go and try and collect the whole world in their backpack. Um, as you limit the player in how much they can carry and potentially as well in how much they can store in static storage, then you increase a micromanagement aspect of the game in which they need to kind of work out what they're going to keep, what they're going to sell, what they're going to ditch. Um, and the further you go down that line, so the more and more restrictive you get, the harder the game becomes for the player in some aspects. And I think you need to think about, as a designer, you need to think about what is a reasonable limit to be set. And this depends on your game, and it depends on the nature of the items that you have in your game. So more complex RPGs, particularly, often will have larger inventories and more generous limits, just because there's so many more items around in the game. But as a kind of a basic starting point, you need to think about what does the player need to be able to carry on them in order to effectively play the core concepts of the game. And if that's combat, which it may be, then you need to be able to carry the things that you need for combat. You may have quite a few of those equipped. So that is one of the tactics, is to, when you equip an item, it gets removed from the inventory and goes into the equipment slot instead. But if you've got crafting, for example, and the player's out and about doing adventuring type stuff, they'll find some materials as they're around. You need enough inventory space for them to comfortably be able to carry a reasonable amount of stuff around with them. If you make it too restrictive, they'll be either wanting to run backwards and forwards to their storage all the time, which becomes boring and grindy, or they're going to start abandoning the idea of being able to do the crafting, or some other reason is going to have an impact somewhere. Very tight inventories can be a good strategy for some games, so for combat games in which you need to think carefully about what is sometimes called the loadouts, which is what equipment are you going to take with you on this particular mission. It could also be a strategy that's used to frustrate the player on purpose in horror games, for example, um, giving players in horror games the feeling of you break a lot of rules in horror games because you don't want the player to feel as powerful or as in control. And this would be one way in which you could do this. So you need to think carefully about your inventory limits, and it is a balance issue getting that right, and it probably only comes right through gameplay and probably through quite extended gameplay of your game, because you can't obviously judge this perfectly through only having players at early stages of the game, because you tend to have fewer items. You can have a tactic of rewarding the player by giving them extra inventory later on in the game, and that's not unreasonable. Again, based on the idea that as games progress, players often find that there are more things they want to carry around with them. And as a player, I'm always one who will target uh, any expansion I can get of my inventory, because I like to hoard things. I'm a hoarder in real life as well. So that's just the kind of player I've become. Uh, and finally, I want to talk about the visual design and the way that people access, particularly inventories, but any kind of storage system in games. Um, I don't want to really spend a lot of time on specifics and how this could be achieved, or brilliant examples, but I think you can find good examples and bad examples out there of layouts and the way things are presented. Some are easier to understand than others. Having consistency, which I talked about earlier, is good, but having clarity is also hugely important. So this falls under the computing aspect of human-computer interaction, sometimes called HCI. And there's a load of gurus out there who produce a whole load of stuff of interest in how to best design interfaces. And an inventory is an interface, a part of a game that's a part of interface for the player. Um, so I think it's important for the players to be able to understand what they're seeing, understand how they interact with it, and how they can use it. I also think that I like the principle of using icons, because a lot of people are visual thinkers, and being able to see visually what it is you have in your inventory can be more helpful to a lot of players than just having a list. And if there's one big criticism I have of the Skyrim approach, it is that mostly you see a text list, and then when you pick a particular one, you get the model of it. And I think this, for some people, is harder to deal with. It's less accessible in some ways. Um, Alongside that, I think there's some concepts that you get in some inventory systems that can be really, really useful. So the ability to do sorting, well, of course, players can do their own sorting by dragging stuff around and putting things in different corners of their inventory. So I would always encourage allowing that inside inventories, especially obviously slot-based inventories. It would be possible for an inventory system to autofill from the top left. It doesn't help the player to be able to organize their stuff if you do that. So I would discourage autofill. Um, you can have auto sort, and I've seen games that do that, which will automatically sort your items into different categories. I've seen also other ways of doing auto sorting. I've seen auto sorting where it will separate out into different parts of your inventory things that the game identifies as being not of use and so are vendor trash. That can be really helpful. Also filtering, so the ability to use some kind of interface thing where you say, actually, I only want to see all my consumables, or I only want to see all my weapons, or I only want to see whatever category is allowed. I would uh, go if I potentially go seriously down this route, and all sorts of options here for filtering because different players will want to filter in different ways. And this becomes, to me, an interesting problem in how best to present this. So, as well as ordering or filtering by object type, you might want to filter by object level if you have level limits on being able to use things, or by object weight, or by object value. There are all sorts of ways that this could be done in useful ways. Okay, so that was. I feel like I've very quickly done this thing about making your inventories useful, um, but I don't want to spend too long. I tend to waffle quite a bit in these videos anyway, which is what I'm doing exactly right now. So I'm going to say, as is traditional, that's it from me for now.